The service I want to talk about first is Amazon Guard Duty. It's a threat protection for accounts and workloads. We often enable Guard Duty on our AWS accounts just because it's an easy way to monitor for some misconfigurations or for some threats that can easily be identified. So you have to think about Guard Duty as something that sits on top of your AWS account and looks for misconfigurations and threats based on some underlying events that could happen. So let's first have a look at what can it do for you and then activate it, and let's have a look at where it gets data from. So what is Guard Duty? I would always recommend to check the documentation. That's the official source, the golden source of information, and it has everything summarized. Often has a note if there's something you have to take into account. So it is definitely worth to spend just a couple of minutes per service just to look at the what is service page and how to get started, or what are the concepts. So it's a threat detection service. So it continuously monitors, analyzes, and processes data sources. So these data sources are then events on the API, for example, or logs that it uses that you might not even have enabled. It would look at those events and logs. So the main reason why there's data breaches happening is because of the AWS credentials. So the AWS credentials are the ones that you configure in IAM for a user to give you programmatically access. So if I go to IAM, so here I have the IAM dashboard and I have 7 users. And you can easily see how you can forget about a user and a key pair that it has. So for example, I here have a key that is 3,390 days old. Luckily, this key doesn't have a lot of permissions. It just has permissions to send an email. But if it has more permissions, you could kind of forget about these keys that you have and have them stored in old files, and they could leak somewhere. And then someone could use those keys and then start to launch EC2 instances, for example, start to use resources from your account. So Guard Duty is something that keeps an eye on your AWS credentials and see if there's any compromised credentials that, for example, suddenly tries to launch 10 EC2 instances. Then it will warn you about those things. Then it also monitors unusual patterns of login events for data exfiltration or maybe destruction that can lead to a ransomware event. So there is another service, and it's called CloudTrail. And in CloudTrail, all the API calls are logged. So you can create your own CloudTrail, but there's also an event history that you can see without having to pay. So you can create your own, but that costs money. But there's definitely here an event history that you can use as well. So read-only is false by default, but you can disable it, and then you can see, should be able to see all the events. So for example, I just logged in with my username at 9:52 today. So this is being logged. I did a list instance on the SSO AWS API when logging in. So this is an API call. So every entry is an API call. I did some more things, but there's definitely a delay as well. So what Guard Duty is going to do is it can actually monitor these events. And then if something of a certain pattern arises or something malicious, they think that is malicious, then it can capture it. Unauthorized crypto mining activity in your Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2, or container workloads. So if there's any traffic pattern or DNS pattern that is happening on an EC2, so for example, I make a lookup to a crypto server that has a specific IP address that is listed, then it will also be visible by Guard Duty. It can do the same for malware on EC2 and also newly uploaded files on Amazon S3. So whenever new files upload to S3, Guard Duty can have a look at it and see if it's malware. Operating system, network, and file events that indicate unauthorized behavior on EKS, which is Kubernetes, ECS, Fargate, EC2 can also be identified by Guard Duty. So there's a lot of sources that guard duty can look at, and it has a list of patterns it will look at. If it matches with a pattern, then it will be visible in guard duty. It also means that there might be some false positives as well, but in general, when we have it enabled, we don't really see that many false positives. The only false positives that we got are mainly on a DNS level, like there was a DNS request that once happened to an IP address that was listed, and it was a false positive. Also, false positives might be that there's an employee logging in from a different country. For example, when he works remote from a different country, that's something that doesn't usually happen, because let's say that employee always logs in from United States and then suddenly from Europe. That's also something that guard duty will log. So let's have a look at how guard duty looks like. So we can press the get started here, and then we have to set up guard duty. So it starts with service permissions. So it actually needs to have access to analyze the VPC logs, to see the traffic, the CloudTrail management events logs that I just showed you earlier, the DNS query logs. You need access to CloudTrail S3 data event logs. So by default, CloudTrail will only log the management API. So you actually have to create your own trail right here. And when you create a new trail, you have to specify if you want to have more than management events. So here, this is just for management events. And then step 2 is going to be the log events, where you can also say, I want to log S3 buckets. Then when you do a put request, that will also be logged. So guard duty wants to have a look at what is being put in S3 buckets to then be able to pattern match there. The EKS audit logs, so that's Kubernetes audit logs, Lambda network activity logs, and RDS login activity logs. So this is the source of guard duty. These are the logs and events that it will use to base its decisions on. And then it also wants to analyze the block storage. So that's EBS is what is attached to the EC2. So that's just to generate the malware detection. So it will scan the storage to identify malware. So I'm going to enable it. Right now I have a 30-day trial, and then we'll just have to wait until it scans the resources, and then we'll be able to see some findings. So here you can find then the protection plans. And these protection plans are also explained in the documentation. So you have a protection plan for S3, for EKS. So depending on what resources that you are using, if you are using Kubernetes, you want the EKS protection plan, but otherwise maybe you don't want it. Most likely you are using S3, so this one is probably one that you want. But you have S3 protection, you also have malware protection. So every protection plan is a little bit different. What I also find interesting is that you can also build some own products based on these sources. So you could, for example, use the events in CloudTrail right here to monitor certain calls that you maybe want to monitor, and you can do it in CloudWatch. So these CloudTrail events you could monitor also yourself. One thing that we, for example, monitor at some of our customers that I know that we monitor at some of our customers is, for example, when you get the permission denied. So what is the rate of permission denied? And if it gets really high, we might want to look into it. And that doesn't always mean that there's a threat. It can also mean just that there's something misconfigured in the application layer. So here you have all these protection plans, but you also have the foundational threat detection. So that's what is explained here. So CloudTrail continuously monitors specific data sources and event logs. The foundational threat detection is the foundational data that it will use. And then you have the use case focused protection plans. So just by putting it on, you already have this foundational threat detection, and then you can go to these protection plans if you want specific protection, for example, for S3, or if you're on Kubernetes and for Kubernetes, and so on. If you want to see some of these findings, we can actually create some sample findings. So if you go to settings, and then there's a generate sample findings here. And then we can have a look at how the findings look like. And then once you don't need it anymore, you can either suspend guard duty or disable guard duty altogether. So in settings, you can also do that. Let's go back. So now we have 358 findings. And you can see that they are classified low, medium, and high. Let's have a look at the high severity findings. And then here, for example, there is the backdoor EC2 CNC activity, and it's being used by DNS, like I said earlier. So what did it identify? It identified that the EC2 instance, this is the ID, is querying a domain name associated with a known command and control server. So once there's a backdoor installed on EC2, it kind of phones home. It makes a connection to a control center, and those IP addresses or domain names are listed in the GuardDuty system. So that's a pattern that it wants to match on. And if in the DNS logs it finds that your EC2 instance makes that call, then it will make this alert. So it's not always for sure if it's a real threat, but you can then examine these threats and suppress them or act on them. So this listing then also has details like the instance details, the IAM instance profile that is attached, so that you can see what is this threat for my AWS account that this EC2 instance is now compromised, because if it then has access to another role that can log into your AWS account, that can then go to other services, maybe launch even more EC2s, then your AWS account itself could be compromised, not just the EC2. You can see what is the network interface, what is the public IP address, and you can see that it was a DNS request using UDP. It was not blocked. It was first seen at this timestamp a minute ago. So then we can, for example, archive this finding if we then create an action like disabled EC2 by stopping or terminating it, for example. So this is one example of these findings. So that's it for GuardDuty on a high level. So threat detection, it has a classification, and there are protection plans available for specific services. The sources are other services within AWS. So this service sits on top of these services that provide these logs and events, but we could also have a look at those events specifically. For example, with CloudTrail, we could make our own trail as well, or investigate ourselves in CloudTrail, which is actually something that I do when there is a certain threat. We often want to just check the CloudTrail as well ourselves to see if there is anything suspicious that can be found.